Hey everybody, Jack Lowe's Painting here with a new video. This is a follow-up to our previous video where we were working on a Maschinen Krieger model, doing some cool scale modeling airbrush tech. And today we're going to get into some cool weathering tech, usually reserved for scale modeling, but you can use it for all of your miniatures and any neat models or dioramas that you're doing yourself. Going to be working with some oil washes. I got the Mr. Hobby oil wash system here, as well as some weathering compounds and enamel washes. I've got these ma.k interactive enamel washes, some rust streaks and dirt and dust deposits. Maschinen Krieger is a very grim sci-fi future. Everything's real lived in and dirty, very similar to another property that we know like Warhammer 40k. So we're going to weather this dude up. Some very realistic looking weathering. First thing we're going to do is our oil wash, like a normal wash that we do on miniatures, but this is way thinner and way cleaner, and it's going to get into all of those little details without staining the model very much. So I'm going to thin it out with our oil wash solvent, also from Mr. Hobby. Put that all over the model, and then go through the back and forth process of cleaning it off and blending it into the recessed details to create that very soft shading that an oil wash is known for. And the cool thing about the Mr. Hobby wash system is it's very easy to work with, and it also dries very fast, like a normal oil wash that you would make by taking some oil paints and some thinners and solvents and mixing that up and then applying it to the model, cleaning it up, blending it out. Well, you have to wait sometimes 48 or more hours just for that oil wash to set up, whereas the Mr. Hobby system is ready to go within minutes of finishing your work. So you can see here, I'm still kind of cleaning off the model, using the solvent in my brush to clean up some of that rind or patina or kind of coffee stain looking stuff that shows up on the model when it starts to dry, where it's really thin on the flat surfaces of stuff. So I'm using the solvent to kind of break that up and wick it away, and also dilute it a little bit more so that it flows into those details. When we do miniatures with this, with the very deep recessed details like you see on Games Workshop miniatures, I apply it much more heavily because I know that that wash is going to concentrate in those bold details and create sort of a black line effect that we can then blend out on the flat surfaces. But on scale models like this, where the detail is very shallow and small and crisp and little tiny details everywhere, like these panel lines and stuff like that, I want it to be fairly subtle. Like, part of these scale modeling techniques is we're going for a realistic look. Whereas with miniatures, it's more of a larger than life look because the proportions aren't realistic, and we want these miniatures to really shine on the tabletops. We want all the details to pop out and, you know, be able to be seen across the tabletop, whereas these more scale model techniques are for a realism look. So if you're painting like a diorama or making some scale models, stuff like that, it's a more realistic, less larger than life kind of look. And a lot of people actually prefer this kind of look for their miniatures. So if you're doing some Space Marines or some Chaos guys, maybe some Deathcore Krieg, maybe bolt action, stuff like that, these techniques are really great for a more realistic look. And the next thing we're going to do once that oil wash is dry is we're going to get out our ma.k interactive stuff. We've got the dust and dirt deposits with the rust streaks and our enamel thinner. And I'm basically going to do the same thing. A little trick here is to use your brush and pour along the handle. And what this does is the liquid will flow directly down into the reservoir or tray or whatever you're using, because it's touching that brush handle and using the surface tension of that liquid to flow down. Whereas if you're trying to pour this out of the little pot, it might just like flow down the side of the pot and get everywhere. So using a little stir stick or the handle of your brush to do that is really helpful. And then I'm going to grab a couple of brushfuls of our rust streaks and put that into the thinner and kind of stir it up to thin it out a little bit, because we want this first step with the rust streaks to be fairly subtle. We want sort of a rusty patina or like a grimy buildup on parts. We don't want like hard chunky rust, because this guy is a working machine. It's a military hardware. So while we are going for more of a grimdark sort of diesel punk look on this guy, we don't want like big neon chunks of rust built up because this is painted, it is maintained, but you know, he's assumably in like a war zone or something like that, so there is preventative maintenance, but it's not like fresh off of the factory floor clean. So we want a working bit of hardware that is maintained, but it's impossible to get it 100% clean because he's probably going off on, you know, battle missions, doing some recon, like, you know, all that kind of stuff. So I'm just gonna apply that in some areas, and if it gets too built up or it pools too much, like if I put too much on the model, I want to quickly kind of wick that away so that we can have a little bit of this build up in the recessed details and sort of areas on the model that aren't moving parts, and water would stagnate, or moisture or like grime would stagnate and then create some rust effects as it slowly eats through some of the paint. Next, I'm going to go back to the rust effects, and I'm going to let that first step dry. It should dry out very, very quickly. The stuff is very thinned out, and we're applying it very thin. And what I'm going to be doing is applying the more concentrated rust effects into some of these details and using my brush to create some streaking effects. So as you can see, I'm going to put the rust effect into some areas, and then what I like to do is actually just use my finger and kind of streak it a little bit, wipe some of it away, because it's a little difficult with a liquid this thin to create a perfect little streak line with a detail brush. Like sometimes what'll happen is you'll create a really good streak, and then right when you pick up your brush, it'll kind of pool right there where the tip of your brush was on the model. So what I like to do is draw some little streaky lines and then use my finger to kind of smudge it and wipe it away in a downward angle, and that creates a more realistic streak. Once that's done, I'm going to take our dust and dirt deposits, thin it out in our little bottle cap there again, and kind of do the same thing that we did with the rust. I have this a little bit more concentrated because the dusty effect and the kind of grimy effect we want to build up, it helps to have this a little bit more concentrated. So I did thin it out slightly. You can kind of play with this at home. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to apply it to some areas and then use a Q-tip to sort of wick it away and streak it at the same time. The way this dirt effect works is a little bit different than the rust effect. So it's going to dry in a very matte finish, and if you leave it, the liquid sort of built up, it may look like it's going to dry semi-transparent, but when it does dry, it's going to give a very dusty, dry appearance. Rather than with a wash, it's just going to dry as like a color filter. So that's why I'm applying it in a small area and then using a dry Q-tip to sort of wick it away and streak it a little bit to make sure that the majority of this dust effect is built up in the areas where the dust and grime would gather. So just be careful, take your time with this. This stuff will dry pretty quickly, which is why I like to do it on one small section at a time. So this is a little bit more time intensive than just doing like a fire and forget wash on 30 guys at one time. where it'll dry a little bit slower and you don't have to worry about it so much. So with this, if you want to do this on a vehicle or some infantry, just do it one guy at a time. Because it dries so quickly, it doesn't take a lot of time. Like, it's not going to take you like 10-15 minutes per guy, 2 minutes. You just like put it on some areas, wick it away, and swipe it with those Q-tips, and it dries up in a snap really, really fast, and it creates a really nice dusty grime buildup on some of those areas. The last weathering step we're going to be doing is some dry pigments. This is some black oxide from Vallejo Pigments. You can see that it's just a dry powder. This is basically what those enamel washes are made out of. They just use a thinning compound to apply to these dry pigments to create a liquid. And this is just the dry version. You can do lots of really cool stuff with it. I personally really like applying it dry as a dust and then blending it with a dry brush. Not a dry brush technique like we're used to doing when we paint, but just a dry brush that is dry. And so I'm gonna get some in the brush and kind of dab it onto the model, and then very gently start moving my brush back and forth to kind of dust it off of there, as if you were dusting the counter in your kitchen, And sometimes it'll build up a little bit more than you might feel comfortable with, but don't worry, because we do have a solution to that. You can do all sorts of different types of dry pigments. One of my favorites is to do rust with dry pigments, because you can apply it very heavily, and then when you use a varnish to seal all of that dusty pigment in, the compounds in the varnish and airbrush thinner will actually dilute it, and it'll kind of magically disappear. So the rust will only show up where it's the most concentrated. I think I've done a couple of models using the dry rust compound here on the channel before, but I like this black oxide because it's great for military type vehicles, because one thing that happens a lot is black carbon buildup from weapon discharges and smoke and things of that nature. So we're applying this black oxide powder all over this guy, and as you can see, it's kind of sticking and combining with the oil wash residue and the enamel wash residue that's still on the model. So what I'm going to do is take a Q-tip, dip it into our enamel thinner, and then touch my Q-tip to a paper towel so it'll kind of suck all the excess moisture out of that Q-tip, so it's just damp. And we're going to use this Q-tip as sort of an eraser tool to clean up some of those areas where that black oxide is just too built up and too dirty looking, and just kind of clean it up, streak it a little bit, so you can kind of have it only in the details and have a little bit of that grimy buildup that's like streaked along the surface. You can see here on the backpack how it was really combining with some of those semi-wet, semi-dried enamel and oil wash compounds. It was just sticking right through there. And then with a Q-tip, you just erase it right off of there, and you have a great carbon grime buildup, especially around those engine housing components where his booster rockets and stuff are. It looks great. Now that all of our weathering compounds are good and dry and everything's done, I'm going to pull out some Ultra Matte Varnish. This Ammo by ma.k Lucky Varnish is my new favorite varnish. I love these. They're airbrush ready, no thinner required. It's awesome. And I'm just going to give a nice coat all over the model with this Ultra Matte Varnish. It's going to unify the finish on everything. It's going to get us that very realistic look. I love a matte varnish on almost all my models, because I like the finish and they photograph really well when they're not reflective. And it also seals all of those weathering compounds in there and protects our paint. And then he's all done. So you can see that the multi-layer of all of these different weathering compounds with the rust and the grime and the streaking and the carbon buildup creates a very realistic looking model for this sci-fi universe. One of the things that really draws me to the Machine and Krieger universe is I love the kind of quirky, wacky looking designs. I love the diesel punk aesthetic. I love the lived in universe look for sci-fi stuff. You see this a lot with Star Wars. In fact, most of these scale modeling techniques were used in the Star Wars movies when Industrial Light and Magic was still making everything using scale models and kit bashes and stuff like that. They would paint this stuff using oil washes and enamel washes and dry pigment compounds, just like I did in this video, to get that lived-in universe look. And they're pretty easy. As long as you don't overdo it and get ahead of yourself, these are very, very easy techniques that anybody can do at home. Almost no skill required. Just be really careful. Hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll catch you next time.